The mob had a plan, but God had a purpose. Today we're looking at Acts chapter 23, and one of the things that stood out to me more than anything else is this. The mob of people had a plan, but God had a purpose. Paul begins this chapter standing before the Sanhedrin and saying that he has lived before God with a clear conscience. Immediately, the high priest orders him to be struck in the mouth. Think about that. Before evidence is ever presented, before charges are proven, before anything has been established, the man that is responsible for upholding the law violates the law. And Paul responds strongly. He calls him a whitewashed wall, a hypocrite, someone who looks righteous on the outside while violating the very standards that he claims to uphold. But then something interesting happens. When Paul realized he is speaking to the high priest, he acknowledges the office, not because the high priest was acting correctly, but because Paul understood the difference between confronting wrongdoing and dishonoring authority. That's a lesson that we really need today. We can call out what is wrong without being disrespectful. Then Paul does something totally brilliant. Knowing that the council is divided between Pharisees and Sadducees, he points them to the real issue, the resurrection, because that's actually what Christianity stands on. Without the resurrection, there is no gospel. Immediately, the room erupts into chaos. The Pharisees begin defending Paul. The Sadducees attack him. The argument becomes so violent that the Romans fear that Paul will literally be torn apart. This is where one of my favorite moments happened. That night, after all the chaos, after all the accusations, after all the threats, Jesus stands beside Paul and says, "Take courage." Notice what Jesus didn't say. He did not say, everything's going to be easy or everything's going to be okay. He didn't say the opposition would go away. He doesn't say, I'm moving every obstacle out of your way. He says, take courage. And then he gives Paul a promise. You must testify in Rome. That changes everything. Because once God says Rome, Jerusalem can no longer be the end of the story. The crowd of Jerusalem can't stop Rome. The Sanhedrin can't stop Rome. The assassination plot can't stop Rome. Because God's purpose is bigger than people's plans. And then we see one of the most overlooked heroes in Acts, Paul's nephew. No angel appears, no miracle happens, no dramatic signs from heaven. A young man simply overhears a conversation. He pays attention and he takes action. And God uses his obedience to save Paul's life. I love that because it reminds us that God doesn't only work through dramatic moments. Sometimes he uses ordinary people who are paying attention. Sometimes the miracle is simply obedience. And then we see more than 40 men take an oath that they won't eat or drink until Paul is dead. Think about how extreme that is. They believe that they're serving God, but they are actually fighting against God's purpose. That's a warning. Religious passion without truth can become very dangerous. Paul understood that better than anyone because he used to be one of those people. He knew what it was like to be sincere and still be wrong. Acts 23 reminds us that opposition does not cancel out God's assignment. People may have plans. The critics may have plans. Your enemies may have plans. Fear may even have its own plan. But if God has spoken, his purpose remains. The mob had a plan, but God had a purpose. And God's purpose always wins. Are you willing to trust God's purpose over man's plan?